Kwakaka'wakw. My name is Alexandre. I'm here with my colleague André Dudemaine. This week, our guest is Gord Hill. If you could introduce yourself, Gord.
Yes, my name is Gord Hill. I'm from the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation in the Pacific Northwest coast, in the so-called province of British Columbia. I've been involved in the indigenous movement since the early 1990s, and for the last few years, I've been doing a lot of comics, like graphic novels. I live in Alert Bay, which is in our traditional territory. It's on northern Vancouver Island. And I live here and I do my artwork, raise my daughter. That's pretty much what I do.
So, Gord, welcome to Rue Adadegen. We have called this podcast Rue Adadegen because this has been a victory for us to have a Mohawk name on the street that before was dedicated to a genocidal English general. And
okay.
So it has been for us a big progress in the toponymy of Montreal. And it was a revendication that we have carried on during many, many years before finally the change happened. So we are really proud, especially somebody that is involved in the resistance movement like you, to welcome you on Adadegen Street. And the first question is, how did you come to be a BDist, somebody who write comic books?
Well, ever since I was a little kid, I was really into comics, and I wanted to draw comics, but my main problem was I couldn't come up with stories. Like I have a hard time making up characters and developing these plot lines and stuff. But I always did artwork, and then when I became involved in resistance movements, I used my artwork to make graphics like logos for posters and T-shirts and stuff like that. And then I became involved with the Native Youth Movement in the mid to late 1990s. And even at that time, I was finding a lot of youth. We were already losing our most recent history of resistance, like Oka, 1990, or the standoff at Chapatan at Gustafson Lake in British Columbia, and Ipperwash. So I started doing these small comics, black and white comics about these incidents, starting with Oka and then Ipperwash and Chapatan. And I did these on 8x11 photocopy type paper, so that anytime we got access to a photocopier, we could just make copies of these comics. They were just 4 to 8 pages. And so when we go to gatherings or powwows or whatever, if I could just get access to a photocopier, I was able to make copies of these little zines, including like band offices, because they always have photocopiers. So that's how I started. And then after a while, I had a collection of these comics, and a friend of mine suggested I could make like a 500 Years of Resistance comic book. So I developed that. I added some more chapters to it. And another friend of mine had a book published at Arsenal Pulp Press in Vancouver. So we took my draft, my comic down to them, and they agreed to publish it. So that was the first edition, which is this one. So these are all the black and white comics. And a lot of these pages were produced in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. And then it was eventually published around 2011, I think. So there are some examples. So we did that, and then I did an anti-capitalist comic book with Arsenal, because there was the anti-Olympic movement and then the G20 in Toronto in 2010. And so I did a short anti-capitalist comic. It was also in black and white. And then when Trump was being elected, Arsenal asked me if I would do an anti-fascist comic book. So we came up with the Antifa comic book, and I'd learned how to color on the computer and add text. So that was an improvement. Arsenal, when they did this comic, it was the first time they did a graphic novel. So it was a little small, and they used like not the greatest paper. So with the Antifa comic, we went to color, and they made it a bit bigger, and so that was an improvement. And then in 2018, I was never really happy with the original 500 Years of Resistance comic book, so I approached Arsenal about redoing it. So then we redid it with the full color version, because my artwork had improved a lot over the years, and there was a lot of gaps in the first edition of the 500 Years comic. There was a lot of things I wanted, and it also needed to be updated because a lot had happened since 2010 or since 2000, the early 2000s. So I wanted to update it and just really do justice to this history of indigenous resistance. And Arsenal did a really good job. Like, we got a bigger format, a better quality paper. So we did that. And then I've done comics for other groups, organizations. And then right now I'm working on a revised, adding some chapters to the anti-fascist comic book, because in that area there's been a lot of developments over the last few years as well. So Arsenal wanted to get some updates. So that's what I'm working on right now.
I suppose you had to do a lot of historical research, because we know that the official story or the official history is told by the colonial point of view, and you have to find the work. How did you work the scenario of your 500 Years of Resistance comic book?
Yeah, it requires a lot of research. It probably takes the most time is the research, because I have to research the history. And so I would go to the library a lot, obviously, and then I was buying history books. And that was for the first edition. But with the second edition, I had, the internet is a much bigger platform now. So I had access to a lot more information. Like with the Taino, who were the first to encounter Columbus. When I did the first edition, I had a hard time finding information from the Taino about the history. But now with the internet, there's Taino websites, and they provide a lot of historical information and cultural information, because I have to research the history, and then I also need to research the culture of each indigenous nation as best I can, to what kind of clothing did they have, what kind of shelters, what kind of weapons. And then the same with the European colonial forces, because they're all different, and it's over a 500-year time period. So I have to research what kind of clothing did they have, what kind of armor, what kind of weapons as well. And so that takes a lot of time. And then from all my history notes, I take that, and then I break it down into a script. And then from my script, I break that down into the individual comic pages, like how many comic panels are going to go on each page, and what text is going to go in each one of those panels, and then what is the graphic that's going to go into that panel. So it's a lot of research, and then kind of like planning of each page. So it's quite a lengthy process for sure. It's a lot of work. But yeah, that's basically how I go about producing a chapter, for example.
Yeah, I think it's when we look at the book, it's really there is a new term, well, relatively new term, speaking about sovereign narrativity. But right now, when we look at the book, we obviously this is an indigenous point of view and history. And of course, being indigenous, it's part of your heritage too. But we know that having it translated or scripted and made into drawings, book, and all the structure of a comic book, it's not obvious that we can give a real indigenous point of view. I suppose on the artistic side, you had also to elaborate your own way of drawing and putting it into comic.
My main purpose was to, for me, history is really important because it explains to us how we came to be in the present situation, or the conditions that we live in today are all the result of history. So understanding that, I think, is really important in just having knowledge of the world we live in today. And then that history of resistance, it can inspire us and the younger generations, or whoever reads the comic book and accesses this knowledge. But then there's things we can learn, like the tactics of indigenous people when they were resisting colonialism. And also, like, one thing I found with the history that we're taught in school, the colonial history, it's really minimal. It's very weak. So I found that there was basically two themes of the history. One is that the European colonial forces arrived in the Americas and basically wiped out the indigenous people who were too weak to resist. And then the other narrative is that it was like a mutually beneficial meeting of two worlds, and the genocide is kind of portrayed as an accidental introduction of diseases, for example. So I think these histories, they kind of, on the one hand, they don't have indigenous resistance, and they minimize indigenous resistance. And then on the other hand, they minimize the genocidal aspects of colonization. So I really thought it was important to have these two aspects of the history in the comic book, because I think the resistance is really important, because the European colonial forces, in many cases, it took a long time for them to actually gain control over different territories. Like with the Mapuche, they never conquered the Mapuche, for example. And that was after 3 centuries of Spanish colonization. And the Maya, it took them a couple centuries to actually control the Mayan, gain control of the Mayan territory. So these types of things, I think, are really important for indigenous people to understand. I was also inspired by Frantz Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth, because he talks about the need to have the indigenous literature. He calls it combat literature, fighting literature. It's like writings that are part of the resistance. And so that was kind of part of my inspiration as well. So that's kind of how I approached making the 500 Years comic.
What struck me, just looking at rapidly at the book, the first at first sight, the thing that came to my mind is that you give back the dignity to the warriors, because usually the warriors are painted as savage, aggressive, against the good looking colonial settlers or soldiers, but here you have the real warrior as the first as a person. You give the when it is possible the name of the main leader of the resistance, and you paint them as a real person that are defending their own territory. That's really, and it is already there in the drawing, even when we, before we begin to read in detail the story of those people you have brought to us in the book.
Yeah, definitely. When I was researching the history, a lot of the history, is written by colonists, settlers, and as you stated earlier, like they portray themselves as the good guys. And the one thing about going through a lot of that historical literature that was written by settlers, because some of this goes back to the 1700s, and even the 1600s and 1500s with some of the Spanish writers and whatnot. So they're all completely racist and openly white supremacist. And so it's a difficult history to read through because they're just so utterly racist. And I can see why a lot of indigenous people wouldn't want to really read this type of history. So I think it's good to go through it because they have like some of the history, the dates, the sites of the battles, that type of stuff. So they've recorded that aspect of the history. Then it's just like reinterpreting it to some degree to put it into the indigenous perspective of how they were resisting these colonial attacks and whatnot. But I think it's really important for indigenous people to reclaim that history and to portray our people as the protagonists, because we're the ones defending our lands and our way of life against this aggression, which it may somehow in the history, the colonial history, they've twisted it around and made themselves look like the good guys, which is completely opposite to the truth.
And now it's interesting also because I think it is the first time this book is translated in French, and this is the publisher is in Sudbury. This is a Franco-Ontarian publisher, and I saw that they have now more and more translation of indigenous authors. I saw the Thompson Highway, Drew Eden Taylor, and of course your book now that will be published in French. Is it the first time it is translated?
No, not actually, no, because with the original 500 Years comic, there was like a pirate edition that was translated and published in Quebec, but it was pirate. They didn't work with any publishers, and then it was actually translated in. Here's a German edition of the 500 Years. It was also translated into Italian. I don't have my copy with me right now, but the Italian publisher actually flew me to Italy a few years ago, and I participated in a radical comic conference. The one thing I'm waiting for is for the 500 Years comic to be translated into Spanish, and I don't know, but see, I've had a lot of offers from people to translate it into Spanish, but my publisher is trying to find a publisher, and their policy is basically publishers will hire their own translator. So it's just kind of this weird bureaucratic process with book publishers and translations. So just waiting for a Spanish edition to be published, because I think that would be really awesome, because half the Americas basically speak Spanish, South and Central America. So I'm kind of waiting for that to happen.
Yeah, especially that the colonization started south with Christopher Columbus. And it's interesting because there is some history that are pretty well known, the conquest of Mexico, for example. But you mentioned the Taínos. I learned a lot about the Taínos resistance by your book, because I didn't know the detail you have put in, and it's really fantastic. And there is several elements in your books that are bringing, I would say, maybe not nouvelle connaissance, but something that is not well known. All of a sudden, this is there. So we see that you have dig really to have the whole story in the episode you wanted to describe.
Yeah, it's kind of when I was researching a lot of these histories, they really are kind of hidden. Like with the Pacific Northwest Coast, for example, what we're taught is basically that the Europeans arrived and the fur trade started, and everybody benefited, and the natives were shrewd, were clever traders, and they took advantage of the opportunity and enriched themselves. And then there was unfortunate disease epidemics. But then when you actually get into the history, there was a lot of conflict and a lot of resistance against these trading ships, and then against the gunboats that the British deployed along the coast, and in Alaska and northern British Columbia with the Russians. And I just find, and I think you could look at almost any region in the Americas and find that there's this kind of hidden history where they've tried to erase resistance, and they've tried to erase the genocide, and kind of like portray it as this, like, it wasn't that bad and everything kind of worked out. And then of course with the modern more current stories of resistance, it shows that this colonization still exists, and that we still have this ongoing resistance that's continued generation after generation. And so I think that's an important part of the history as well. But definitely a lot of erasure and minimizing of struggle is what I find researching the history.
Another thing that looking at your books, that well, I am not surprised, but it's not common. Normally, usually the indigenous militants are in their own cause, their own organizations. And even if they have with the anti-capitalist or Antifa, once in a while agreement to some action or some protest, they don't mix that much. And you are as involved in the Antifa and anti-capitalist fight, it seems to me, at least as an author, than you are in the indigenous resistance.
Yeah, my politicization process actually came through anarchist punk music. So the anarchism is kind of a foundation of my politics in terms of Western society, how to analyze Western society as a capitalist system. And then my first group I was involved with was an El Salvador solidarity group. And this was in the late 80s. And at the time, El Salvador was involved in a civil war. There was a revolutionary movement that was fighting against the fascist government of El Salvador, which was backed up by the United States. And then after that, it was actually OCA in 1990 that I really turned my focus to indigenous peoples, indigenous struggles, and kind of went back to kind of relearn or learn more about my own ancestry and stuff like that. Because I had lived on the res as a kid, and I grew up around my culture with the potlatches and stuff like that. But we moved to the city when I was young, and I kind of got acculturated, like lost a lot of my cultural bearing, and that's kind of why I got into anarchist punk. But that radicalized me, so that when Oka happened, I was already a radical, but that really inspired me. I think it inspired Indigenous people across the country, and it re-inspired the warrior spirit and the warrior culture of Indigenous people. So it was obviously a very important historical moment. And so I didn't just abandon my anarchist politics. So I've always been involved in both areas. I see one as an anti-colonial resistance and the other as anti-capitalist resistance. So those are the two politics that I promote, is anti-colonialism and anti-capitalism. And then nowadays, with the rise of the far right, anti-fascism is an important movement today. And so that's why I work in that as well with the Antifa comic book. And I was involved in anti-fascist organizing when I lived in the city, but now I live in Alert Bay. It's a small town. Half the town is native, and there's just not really many. There's not many outright fascists running around the small town here. So,
well, I suppose they wouldn't be welcome in that place anyway.
Yeah, I know.
I am curious to see beyond the comic book. Now we see that there is a surge of the extreme right movement, and even just in South, with the new government, the new president in the United States. And how do you see the indigenous resistance what orientation should it take in front of this new background, political background we have in front of us?
Well, I think first of all, I think Indigenous people have kind of like a tendency to adopt the anti-racist position because they're the victims of white supremacy and racism. And so I think it's in their interest to adopt an anti-fascist position. But I think what we kind of need is like a multinational resistance movement, because we have so many different peoples that are living here in North America. And so there's a need for an Indigenous movement that's focused on Indigenous peoples and Indigenous struggles, because no one else is gonna, fight for us, or, defend our territories and whatnot. But I think there's a need to have solidarity with these other social movements, because that gives us more power, and it expands the resources that we have access to. And I think it's in all these movements' interests to kind of join together and have some kind of solidarity. So that's what I promote, along with the anti-colonialism and anti-capitalism, is the concept of multinational resistance, and trying to form some kind of solidarity with other organizations and movements. And I think that's especially a valuable lesson from history when you're faced with the rise of fascist movements that actually gain power. I think that's a really important foundation to have, is the social solidarity between different movements, because that's just going to give you more strength to fight back against the fascists.
Yeah, and I think also we may be forced to join together, because I recently saw that in the United States, when they raid places to catch what they call illegal immigrants, sometimes they catch indigenous people because if you are brown, they think you are not a real American, and I saw some Navajo leaders really upset because of that situation, and we posted in our social medias when Elder said, "Who is illegal on a stolen land?" So we see that the situation can evolve, that the two movements can have the same resistance together.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Are you looking forward to have an update on the Antifa comic book, since the landscape has changed so much in the last years?
Yeah, I just finished, I think it was like 20 pages I just finished. And then, but now because Trump has regained power, it already changed some of the chapters that I just updated. Like there was a chapter on the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol building. So I did a chapter on that, and I did some mention about all the arrests and the convictions and the imprisonment of all these people. And then Trump released them all, pardoned them all. And so there's an update. And then all the stuff that Trump's done in the first week of taking power. And then Elon Musk's coming into the picture as well. And so that's, so they've asked me to update again to add another chapter now about Trump and Musk. And also they asked me to do a chapter on the far right in Israel, because of the genocide that Israel has conducted in Palestine. And with the rise of the far right, and they're taking power in different countries and whatnot, it's like in a few years we could do another update, because there's going to have been so many changes, because the far right is on the ascendancy right now. It's rising around the world. And so it's a very volatile time in history. There's a lot of changes occurring. And it's not just in the political spectrum, like with the fascists and the far right, because we have climate change, which is having major impacts on society, on the economics of the capitalist system, on refugees and migration. And then we also have these wars going on in Ukraine and in Gaza, in the Middle East in general, and the U.S. invasion of Iraq and all that. And so it's creating all this change. It's creating refugees. The refugees in turn are leading the far right are exploiting these refugee crises to build their movements. And so everything's kind of piling up on one another. And I mean, the COVID pandemic is like a good example of how fragile the system is, because just this little pandemic, which I don't think was a huge type of pandemic, but it had a major impact on the global capitalist system that we were just kind of recovering from. And then now we got hit with all this inflation and the Ukraine war, the cost of grain, wheat, and that, so everything's being affected by one another, because we live in such a globalized society. Everything's in change, and everything is in decline as well. So we're entering into this period of instability, and it's a dangerous time. But at the same time, these types of crises present opportunities for resistance movements. And so it's definitely a very interesting time in history to be alive.
Yes, and certainly it's an interesting time for somebody who write about history, because it seems that the history is accelerated in the period we are living now. I saw that there was a documentary at it was in January, the Sundance Film Festival, about Leonard Peltier, and they had just before the festival to add a scene because Biden commute his prison term to he will be obliged to stay at home, but at least he won't be in a jail no more. And they had to, the film was finished, and they had to adjust to the new reality. That's somehow crazy, but that, in a sense, stimulating too.
Yeah, definitely. There's so many surprises that were. I mean, that clemency was, I think, took a lot of people off guard because they've been campaigning for 50 years for Leonard Peltier's release, and every time there's a president outgoing, there's lobbying to get him to grant Peltier clemency, and every president has refused. And of course, the FBI, they lobby the presidents to not grant clemency. And in fact, they organized protests. It's the only time the FBI ever organized a protest, with picket signs and walking around in that to protest against even the possibility that Leonard Peltier would be considered for clemency. And so Biden really surprised people with that, I think, especially after over a year of him supporting the genocide in Gaza. And I think people had lost a lot of respect, if they had any, for him to start with, and just really saw him as this really kind of like a degenerate person. And then he grants Leonard Peltier clemency. So yeah, that was definitely a surprise, but a good one.
Yeah. One of the few good ones. If we, I am certain that many people that are listening to this podcast now would want to have your books. So how can I suppose we go to through internet to command it, or?
Yeah, it's probably your best bet. You can order directly from Arsenal Pulp Press.
Okay. Yeah, it's better than Amazon.
The link is underneath.
Yeah. The French edition, I'm not sure the publisher. There it is there.
Yeah, Prise de Parole. Yeah, it's there.
Prise de Parole. So that's how to get the French edition. But they do seem to be fairly widely available. A lot of teachers have used the book in their classroom, starting with the black and white, the first edition. This one sold, I think, almost 25,000 copies, and a lot of teachers were using it in their classrooms. And so hopefully that'll continue with the new revised edition, which I think is a lot better. I hope they've stopped publishing the black and white, the first edition, and that this will be the only one available from now on. But yeah, it seems like it's pretty accessible and easy to get, so that's good.
So obviously we will tell the librarians and teachers that's really a good resource to have the real story from the point of view of the indigenous people of America, instead of the fantasy of the colonial protagonist. So, Gord, it was really an honor to have you with us, and we hope we'll stay in touch, and that you can, with a new book to be part again on this podcast on Atadagan Street.
Yeah, I just have one question before we finish this. If like, I wonder if we were to document the demands and resistance activities of various indigenous nations across Canada, do you think it could be done in a graphic novel similar to the 500 years of resistance?
I think it could be done. I think that's one of the great things about the comic format is it's really I find it's like a really a good method of communication because it's accessible to people like young people and adults and older people and people who have a hard time reading with with literacy because there's less text to have to go through. I think it's really accessible, so I think it's a very good format for doing that type of stuff, even for like manuals, like for teaching skills and just about anything. I think the comic format is a really good option, along with other forms of communication. Like podcasts and videos and posters. All these diverse forms of communication are really important. I value the comics because you can get a little bit more information into them, and the artwork helps convey a lot of the information as well. So yeah, I think it could definitely be used for what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think there's like 40 years of history of negotiation with the Eskimo people, with the government of Quebec. And Innu people too, which is André is from, with the CAM, Conseil des Atikamekw Montagnais. I think we could do a graphic novel with that.
Well, it's a dull story. Nothing happened.
But yeah, that's one thing. Yeah, one thing I found with some parts of the stories, because the comic is definitely more successful with the action. If there's some action happening, basically, I think a lot of comics they basically try to have one action shot, one panel of action per page. But you can also do dramatic scenery like they do in movies with the lighting and the camera angles and stuff like that. It's a lot of similarities between comics and movies actually, because movies are based off of storyboards, which are basically comics, and they use those to plan their shots and whatnot. So anything's possible.
Yeah.
So we can encourage young artists to look at this form of expression, especially to tell our own story in a way that is very popular, because it's part of the pop culture, the comic books, and it helps to reach to more people than the usual form of a book or an essay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you again, Gord, and we each Wednesday it is for those who are listening to us, each Wednesday at noon. It's Rendezvous on Rue Adadégan with artists and leader of the indigenous realities and arts and cultures and resistance. We are part of it.
Oh, for sure. All right.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me. Thanks for having me, and good luck with your show. Oh.
See you next week.